because I don't think it's as much about size. There's huge emphasis on the question of the size around failure. Much more important for me is the context. What is seen as systemic can in fact be a small entity. It need not be big. It depends on its interconnectedness. It depends on how people see that entity. It depends on who the clients, the customers are of that entity. And therefore, it is not, if we focus simply on size, I think we will miss the point that in actual fact a systemic consequence can arise because a bank or an institution is seen as systemic because of the perception of the way it's held, the esteem with which that entity is held, its interconnectedness, and it can be a small entity, not necessarily a big entity. So I want us just to perhaps not assume that this too big to fail is the only discussion that needs to take place. It is not simply about size. I think the second thing that I'd like to point out is the question of the cost of this crisis a little bit. If you look at it, some of the costs that have been incurred as a result of this crisis are simply huge. They are huge. What is the biggest risk? Personally, I think one of the biggest risks facing us going forward is the size of the fiscal deficits. These are just incredible if you look at what has to be done, and there are so many countries with that very high levels of fiscal deficit. And how you come out of this huge global imbalance is going to be something that's a challenge going forward for all of us. The second question is high unemployment. What you're seeing as a consequence of the Great Recession is a very high level of unemployment, a question that where you are seeing some growth recovery, it is not necessarily having employment as part of that recovery, and levels at which societies begin to really be challenged. A country like Spain, 5 times the size of Greece, unemployment reaching 20% and expected to go higher. So very big challenges that you have around one of these consequences. If you looked at the total fiscal global package that has been expended in trying to create a bottom, a floor to this recession, to date it has been over $2 trillion or 3.2% of global GDP. These are astronomical numbers. The banks, which is primarily the developed banks, your big investment banks, the household names, have so far had to raise over $1.5 trillion to address their capital requirements. And if you look at Greece itself as one of the countries that have been in the limelight at the moment around the problems it's experiencing, being part of the euro area, part of its options, especially the question of a currency devaluation, is not there. It has a budget deficit of 13% of GDP, and bear this in mind, the Maastricht Treaty being part of Euroland, it's expected to be at 3%. Its public debt is at 120% of GDP versus the Maastricht Treaty of 60% limit. It's had a 30% loss of international competitiveness, and its current account deficit is currently 10% of GDP. If you look at what this means, regaining competitiveness implies at least 20% price deflation. Greece's taxes are already 35% of GDP. Correcting the budget deficit by 10% of GDP, that's moving it down from 13% to the 3%, implies a decline of 15 to 20% in its GDP. Deflation and depression will boost debt to GDP ratios to above 180%. And in essence, the tool of managing some of this, enabling your currency to devalue, is removed because of its commitment and being part of the euro. But countries have different choices. And I mean, if one just had to look at some of those questions, just to use one example for South Africa, when we have a counter-cyclical approach at the moment, finance has, the National Treasury and the Ministry of Finance is looking at what borrowing do we need to do. When it's finished its borrowing cycle, we should be at around 40% debt GDP ratio. So Japan is already at 200. So you've got huge problems in the developed world that are going to impact on the choices other countries have. It's often asked, well, you know, China can do this, China can do that, China will show the way out. Just to give you an example, South Africa has reserves of, depending on valuations of up and down on the currencies that you invest in, we have them around at around $42 billion at the moment, US dollars. China's reserves are $2.447 trillion US dollars. In the last quarter, it thought it had a slow accumulation of reserves at $47 billion US dollars for the quarter. It has choices. Very few countries in the world have Chinese choices. So that when one asks what South Africa or other countries can do, you've got to take those circumstances into account, and saying that what China does is an example. Well, there's only one China. And we need to bear that in mind when we look at what we can do. And recognizing that in this challenging environment, you can do everything that you need to do as a country. And you can be doing the best you can. In many ways, our macroeconomic numbers and what we're doing stand us in very good stead. I mean, we're coming from a budget surplus into this deficit that we will be managing down again. Our deficit at around 7.2% or slightly lower. And you'll still be impacted. We are one of the few countries in the world that did not have a systemic banking crisis. And there are very good reasons for that. But it does not mean that our economy is not hit by the recession because of what has happened elsewhere in the world. And therefore, we need to be very cognizant of the environment that you work in and the challenges that you face in that context to be able to address the challenges that we need to do, the things we need to do, and we will still be impacted in relation to what is happening in the rest of the world. So an understanding when you're looking at governance, when we're looking at what's going on, of what is going on in the rest of the world, is crucially important for the choices that we have. I would like to deal with a particular aspect for today's conference, and that is focusing on the governance and the central bank, specifically referring to central bank independence. It's often argued that there are three pillars of central bank governance: central bank independence, central bank accountability, and central bank transparency. The notion of central bank independence is actually relatively new, and the rationale was to prevent monetary policy from being used for short-term political expediency. For example, by lowering interest rates just before an election and then raising them immediately afterwards. This is called the political interest rate cycle. Politicians have much shorter time horizons than the monetary policy time horizon, and could therefore be less concerned about the longer-term effects and impact of their actions relative to the short-term political gains that they can achieve. The Bank of England is often held up as the epitome of central banking best practice, but we need to recognize that it only achieved independence in 1997 when the Labour government came into power. Before that, interest rates were determined by the Treasury. Central bank independence is not absolute. It is useful to distinguish between what is referred to as goal independence and operational instrument independence. Central bank officials are not elected, they're appointed. Therefore, it is appropriate that in a democracy, a democratically elected government should set the goals of what a central bank should achieve. Consequently, it's generally the case that central banks do not have goal independence. For example, in most countries that have adopted inflation targeting environments and frameworks, the government sets the goal, either on their own or after consultation with the central bank, and gives the mandate to the central bank. South Africa follows this general practice. Instrument or operational independence is the independence the central bank then has to determine the tools to achieve the goal or mandate that is set by government. And it has that ability to set the operational tools and how you would do it without political interference.